wanna give love to the city, that's a fact. But you're gonna need help if you wanna make an impact. Well endowed, you want to be well endowed with the Edmonton community. Things really happen when you find that you're well endowed.
YEGPodfest. My name is Fonda Mithrash. I am the festival producer. This is a brand new collaboration between LitFest, which is Canada's nonfiction festival, and the Alberta Podcast Network. And this year we are presented by Edmonton Community Foundation. This festival has also been made possible by the Edmonton Arts Council's Connections and Exchanges Initiatives grant program and the City of Edmonton. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, CBC Edmonton, CBC Podcasts, and McBain Camera. I will acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you live from Treaty 6 territory. We are grateful to present from this historical meeting and gathering space and home to many Indigenous nations, including the Cree, Nakota Sioux, Papas Chase, Blackfoot, Métis, and others. We extend our hands in respect and friendship to the treaty signatories and to all Indigenous nations, and also strive to honor the tradition of sharing stories on this land and from this land now too, out to you everywhere in the world, because that's how we do things in this pandemic festival style. So before I get to our event this afternoon, which is a panel discussing the wonderful world of Bollywood and Bollywood podcasts, I'll tell you a little bit about the platform that we're using. This webinar, the event will be about an hour. You have an opportunity to ask our guests questions. You can submit those using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A box will send your question to the off-screen moderator, and that will be fed to our host. And we will try and include as many of those as possible within the hour, as many of your questions as possible. There's also the option to see live captioning with this platform, and you can access the captions by pressing the CC button at the bottom of your screen as well. So with that, the host of our panel today is Erin Fraser. She has been podcasting since 2012. Together with culture critic Paul Matwichuk, she has recorded over 300 episodes of Trash Art in the Movies, which is a podcast that pits highbrow against lowbrow films and declares a winner every episode. It's fabulous. And since 2015, she and Matt Bose have been running Bollywood is for Lovers as a way of sharing their growing interest in Hindi language cinema. And Bollywood is for Lovers now boasts over 120 episodes and over 1 million listens. They recently hit their 1 millionth download, so congrats, guys. And Bollywood is for Lovers is also a member of the Alberta Podcast Network. So you're all in very good hands for this conversation with Erin. And with that, I will hand things off to her. And thanks again for joining us, everyone. I hope you really enjoy this panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Fonda. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so excited to be bringing together some of my favorite podcasters for this discussion. As a bit of background, part of the reason why Matt and I started Bollywood is for Lovers is because when we started to get into Bollywood and Hindi language cinema, and then Indian cinema as a whole, we couldn't find a lot of podcasts discussing Indian cinema, which is crazy to us. It's the country that produces more films annually than anywhere in the world. The Bollywood industry itself is enjoyed by 3 billion people worldwide, and it sells twice as many tickets as Hollywood films do. And anytime Bollywood came up on Trash Art in the Movies, we got a really positive response. And so we thought, there's really there's an audience for this. We're really interested in this. And so we started our podcast. And I'm so happy to say that since we did, we've met some other fantastic podcasters who are also talking about Indian cinema and Bollywood, some of whom were doing it before us, some of whom has joined us in the 5 years since we started. And so I'm just really excited to introduce you all and to some of my favorite podcasters, and to have this discussion about how film podcasts are very popular. They've been around since podcasts started. And I pretty much exclusively listen to film podcasts, but so few discuss Indian films. And I'm really interested in why that is, and also how we go about filling this gap in the podcasting world. So to start, I'm going to introduce you to the man who beat us to the punch. He was doing this before us, Asim Burney of UPodcast Khandaan. Asim, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your show and how you got into podcasting?
Hi, Erin. Yes, I started ages ago. I'm an oldie now. I think our first episode of You Podcast back in the day dropped in 2009, December 2009. And I think 3 years ago, we spun off into our new show, which is the Khandaan podcast. And I think the timing was right. And I think just the concept was nice and it just kind of picked up from there. But I mean, it's very similar to you. I grew up in Belgium, which is a tiny hub. There's not a lot of South Asians there. And Bollywood, the VHS from Bollywood that my parents used to bring in, that felt like a connection to home. So I always just loved Bollywood cinema. And then when I moved out of Belgium, I just wanted to talk with my friends about movies. And I just basically ripped off the concept from Slash Filmcast, which is a very famous podcast. And I was like, hey, if they can do it, I can do it. And at that time, I didn't even know that many Bollywood fans, but Twitter kind of introduced and connected, as it connected you and me, you know. So thank you, Twitter, for that. And since then, we've been just, doing podcast and loving it pretty much.
Thanks so much, Asim. Awesome. Excuse me. Asim told me before the podcast that his name was pronounced like awesome, and now I feel like I'm going to call you awesome. Next, I want to introduce Manish Mathur of It Pod to Be You and Queer and Now. Now, Manish doesn't necessarily have a podcast that's completely devoted to Indian cinema or Bollywood, but he does discuss Indian cinema and Bollywood in his podcast, It Pod to Be You. Manish, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your show and how you got into podcasting? Oh, Manish, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Hi. Thank you so much for inviting me on here. I'm very excited to be here with you all. And yeah, I've been podcasting since 2017, I believe, a bit newer than both of you. And I started podcasting when I was writing with Talk Film Society. I still write with them. And I started with a podcast on M. Night Shyamalan and his films, and since then moved on to podcasting about romantic comedies, romance films, and queer films. And so in those pursuits, I've been, podcasting about Hindi cinema a few times here and there. And I also write a lot about Hindi cinema. And I'm really, really excited to be here. And much like both of you, I didn't really know too many people who followed Bollywood and covered Bollywood in a critical lens. And so thankfully through Twitter, social media, and I was able to meet all of you guys, and I'm really, really excited. I think I met Asim through Bollywood is for Lovers. I remember listening to Asim there. And Erin and Matt, I both met you, I think just randomly looking for Bollywood podcasts, and yours was the first one that came up. So I found you guys there, and we've been friends, I think, since for like last couple of years. So I'm really, really excited to be here.
Yeah, and I will say that Manish has guested on, I think, all the notable Bollywood podcasts, and it's always lovely to hear his perspective. And you reached out to us because you heard that we wanted to discuss Katrina Kaif.
Yeah.
And so I immediately liked you.
I remember I slid into it. It was either yours or Matt's DMs being like, hey, if you guys do a Katrina episode, I'm going to invite myself on, even though you hardly know me.
Yes. And we were thrilled. And,
yes.
We've had you on since.
Yeah.
Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Ankur Desai, whose podcast Parde Peeche is one of the newest Bollywood podcasts to come on the scene, and it's made down in Calgary, our neighbors to the south. So I am so excited that not only are more Canadians podcasting about Bollywood and Indian cinema, but more Albertans are. Ankur, welcome. And can you say a bit about yourself and how you got into podcasting and your show?
Hi, yeah. So I've been listening to podcasts for quite a while now, since like 2017. And one day I wrote a tweet about Sanjay Leela Bhansali's like choreography and the way he blocks dance sequences. And my one friend from university, Risa, she messaged me saying, "Hey, do you want to start a podcast about Indian cinema?" And I said, "Yes." I wasn't really sure exactly what we were going to tackle and like what we're going to talk about, but we realized like, oh, there's not a lot of academic and critical discussion of Indian cinema, especially in like North America or like at least Canada. So we thought, hey, let's do our small little part because, like I said, we both went to the University of Calgary and we both like majored and minored in film studies. So yeah, we met through being part of like the Film Society film program and NUTV, which is like the television station. So through that, we just started podcasting, and we're the youngest, I'm guessing now, because our first episode was released in February of 2019. So it's almost been a year for us. We recently hit our like 1,000 download mark. So we're still in our infancy, but we love it and we're doing it. We're trying to do new things. And I guess like we're more focused on Indian cinema and not just Bollywood. So we're talking about like Bengali cinema and Tamil cinema and all the other great places about in India.
Which I think is really important.
Yeah.
Matt and I are always getting requests to talk more about South Indian cinema and Bengali cinema and other industries. But we do specifically focus our show on Bollywood. And so we've always said, like, someone else should do that. So I really appreciate that we can direct people to your episodes on other industries now whenever they ask us to try and cover them, because we don't have the time or the knowledge, because Indian cinema is huge. And so as outsiders, when we started, we specifically chose Bollywood as a gateway because we ourselves were starting to learn about it. And trying to cover everything it's hard. So I commend you for really branching out to other industries.
Yeah, that's like one of the reasons we wanted to branch out, because a lot of people do know Bollywood and that's like their first introduction to like Indian cinema in general, or it's like Bengali cinema like Satyajit Ray and Ritvik Katak and stuff. So we thought, okay, we need to show that there's more stuff out there. And that was kind of like the impetus of like wanting to do Tamil cinema and I was going to try to do more Southern cinemas. So yeah.
Well, this leads me to quite naturally to my next question for you all. And some of you have already kind of answered this a bit, but hopefully you can elaborate. Why you chose to focus on Indian cinema and Bollywood, or how, for you, Manish, how you incorporate Bollywood into your podcasting, and why you think it's important to discuss Indian cinema. Because obviously, you know, we could all be podcasting on any films we want, but I think we've all made a conscious effort to discuss Indian cinema, whether it's incorporating it in a larger conversation like romantic comedies like you have, Manish, or to devote our shows to Indian cinema. So Manish, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Pod to Be You is my podcast. The format is essentially I invite a guest and they pick a romantic comedy and we chat about it. So I've had the pleasure of having many, you know, guests who love Bollywood films and who, you know, run the Bollywood podcast. So naturally they chose, you know, some Bollywood films like Humpty Sharma Ki Dulhania we talked about once, Pride and Prejudice, which is not Bollywood, but Bollywood adjacent, and Ye Dil Lagi. So I think, you know, it kind of comes for me, like when I seek out guests for the podcast, I'm looking for people who can provide diverse voices and things like that. And Bollywood just comes up. And I think like romantic comedies, I think are a huge part of the Bollywood industry. And I think some of the best romantic comedies have come from India. And I think it's such a rich tradition of romance in that industry. So it's like hard to ignore it. You know, you kind of have to, because there's so much there. And romance is such an integral part of every Bollywood film, or almost everyone, especially, the older ones. And, for me, I think talking about Bollywood on podcasts is so important for a number of reasons. One is that there's just not that many out there, as we've all said. There's, so few of them out there. And it's such a rich well of discussion in terms of, politics and cinematic technique and things like that. And for me, I think, anecdotally, a lot of my experience with talking about Bollywood, before I met all of you and before I was more active on like the Bollywood Twitter scene, is that people will consider it as like time pass, something to like watch on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday night, and you just watch it, enjoy it, and then you turn it off, and there's really not much room for critical analysis. And for me, as someone who loves Bollywood and loves to talk about films from a critical lens in terms of both content and the style and the message, the meaning, the things like that, I found it a little frustrating that whenever I would try to have a discussion about a Bansali movie or a Yastropa movie or a Kashyap movie or anything like that, the discussion was like, yeah, it's a good movie, but is it really worth talking about? Or like, this movie just wasn't as good as Hollywood movies or Japanese movies. And so for me, I'm like, a lot of the reasons why I talk about Bollywood so much on podcasting or in my writing or just in general in my social media accounts is like, I want to get it known there that actually these movies are worth talking about on a critical lens, in an analytical lens. And there's a lot there, and that there's, of course, there's artistry to it, there's meaning to it, there's a lot to discuss and kind of pour over and unpack. So for me, that's the main reason. I just want people to like look at these movies in a way that is different than I think how, at least in my experience, in my personal life, people have talked about these movies.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to have a conversation about romantic comedies and not touch on Bollywood.
Right.
And yet so many people have.
Yeah.
Probably because they are not aware of all of the
yeah.
amazing romantic comedies that are coming out of India. My partner, Matt, who I do Bollywood for Lovers with, I don't think anyone would peg him for to be like a big fan of romantic comedies. But once we started watching Bollywood, let me tell you, he will get excited to explain to you why Bethik Ray is great. Which,
Exactly.
It's also funny when you have like on Twitter lists of best musical numbers or best composers, and you have nobody from Bollywood or India in there. It happens all the time, and I make it a point every time to retweet and add Katrina Kaif to it or A.R. Rahman to it, or like, how can you think you're a film critic if you have just like blacked out a whole zone of cinema? I don't understand. It's a pet peeve of mine. I get really annoyed by it.
Absolutely, same here. Major pet peeve.
I think many people have seen me on Twitter anytime like lists of female filmmakers have come up, and I've been like, oh, you missed Farah Khan and Zoya Akhtar and many other women. So Asim, what would you like to add about why you chose to focus on Bollywood and why you think it's important to discuss Indian cinema?
I mean, I think all of us are film buffs just generally. So we have seen movies from any cinema, any kind of country. We try it out. It might work for us, it might not work for us. But I think whatever happens with Bollywood, it just hits you like comfort food, that food that you've grown up with. It's like dal chawal or I don't know, poutine or something like that just kind of, hits you like nothing else does. And it's also just the uniqueness of Bollywood. I think there's nothing really like it. Like, I feel there are similarities between, let's say, Italian cinema and Polish cinema, and then the offshoots of that have been very much influenced by it. Like if you look at, New Hollywood, there's a direct line with French cinema there, right? But Bollywood has always been kind of insulated from all of those influences and been its own beast. And I think that's why, to a certain degree, Bollywood also didn't change. It was almost like family viewing. You watch it with the whole family together. And that's funny because the last few years, there's more creation of different genres in Bollywood. And the audience has kind of balked against that. Like, oh, I can't take my kids to that because that's what they've grown up with, So it's kind of like a funny situation there. I think also with Bollywood podcasting specifically is the same story that we have with Bollywood and Indian cinema is that we're looking for validation. And I think for you, me, people that didn't grow up in India and Pakistan and have been part of kind of the Western hemisphere, we are looking for acceptance and validation of us, but also of our cinema. And that cinema being an aspect of who we are, the way we love, the way we see friendship, like our friendships are very deep, our love is very strong, our heartbreak is the biggest ever. So all of these things are kind of like an extension of the cinema that we've grown up with. So I think it's just kind of like a balance between those two. And I do think sometimes the voice I have online or the podcast I create, it is about trying to find some validation by people that don't know about me, don't know about my cinema, don't know about my emotions.
Ankur, what about
Yeah,
you?
yeah, I think there's like the big reason me and Risa started this podcast was we saw like there's not a lot of podcasts discussing Indian cinema in general or like an academic lens even. So it felt like, oh, this would be a great place for us, a really unique spot for us to kind of put our identities and our love for Indian cinema and put it through this critical lens and historical lens and understanding why we love it. Because like, yeah, we grew up watching these movies and we love them and we see like the merit in them. But why is it that we can't, like talk about it on an academic perspective? Like why is there like this small little problem like that's kind of bugging us and like makes us go like why isn't there more people discussing it? So that's where I think like the importance comes from, is because you see a lot of people discuss Bollywood as like, oh, song and dance or melodrama. And yes, that is true to a certain extent, like a huge extent of it. And that's like what's so appealing about it. But underneath it all, there's so much like variety and there's so much like to discuss in terms of politics, in terms of gender, in terms of like sexuality, even like race relations and stuff like that. And so, how do we discuss that? How do we like talk about it in a nuanced manner so that we can, I guess, move forward?
Hmm.
But yeah,
Well,
so
and I don't know about you, Encore, like when you were in university, but
yeah.
when I was in university studying film,
Mhm.
we actually did watch 3 Bollywood movies in the course of, or I watched 3 Bollywood movies in the course of
Mhm.
getting my degree, which I'm really grateful for. But when I went back to my film textbook, kind of my film 101, although we didn't have 101 back then, it was 201, my film 201, like history of world cinema textbook,
Mhm.
which is like 800 pages. There is like maybe 3
Yeah,
devoted to Indian cinema.
yeah.
And, and it talks about how great parallel cinema is, but
Mhm.
which I agree. I love a lot of parallel films
Yeah,
and filmmakers. But what it had to say about Bollywood was that it was mindless entertainment made for low class people.
yeah.
And that really shocked me, that judgment in a book
Mhm.
that was trying to, encompass the history of world cinema, that it could be so dismissive of films that 3 billion people worldwide enjoy. Because just
Exactly.
because something is popular doesn't mean it doesn't have artistic value, doesn't mean that there isn't merit in discussing
Mhm.
it, whether you want to criticize it or you want to praise it.
Yeah,
There's a value in that. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we're all talking about
exactly.
Bollywood in our podcast. So I'm curious how, and again, some of this you've touched in some of your answers. So if you want to add to this, or you feel like you've already covered it, that's fine. But I'm interested in how you choose what to discuss on your show and what you think is the most important aspect of Bollywood or Indian cinema to highlight in your analysis, in your ongoing discussion that you're having within your shows.
Mhm.
Asim, why don't we start with you?
I mean, for us, Khandaan is kind of a themed podcast. And I was because I had been podcasting for a while. And I'll be honest with you, podcast, I felt I was adrift. I didn't know where I was going to take the podcast. Was I going to quit? I remember even telling you, Matt and Erin, about it, that I don't know where to go with this anymore. And then I think Serial hit, and that kind of brought podcasting kind of to the forefront, and there were so many new ones. And for me, I kind of combined How Did This Get Made with Denzel Washington is the greatest actor of all time together, and then made that like the Khandaan podcast. And so I had a very clear idea about what this podcast was going to be. And I remember finding the first email I sent my co-host Amrita and Sujoy, and I was just amazed by how clear the concept was then, and it is exactly what it is now. But for us, that theme, so for the people that don't know, Bollywood for the last 30, 40 years has been dominated by three actors, which is Amir Khan, Salman Khan, and Shah Rukh Khan. And we basically look at Bollywood through that lens. Sorry, lost my voice. But it's basically a jumping off point for having any kind of discussion what we want. And we do have what we've been watching, trailers and news and stuff like that. But then we let our guests, or like a poll, we do an audience poll, let them pick what we're going to talk about. So there's one movie every show, and then that's a jumping off point for current discussions, current stuff that we watched.
Yeah, your co-hosts were horrified when Matt and I recently chose Doom 3.
Oh, that was
You
such a good.
backed us up.
Hey, you used to, like Manish did with you guys. If you want to talk Katrina Kaif, I'm there, and then it becomes a 3-hour podcast.
That is why we chose to talk about Doom 3, or it was part of why we chose to talk about Doom 3.
And tap dancing.
Pardon me?
And tap dancing.
Oh yeah, tap dancing. Ankur?
Yeah, I don't like the reason. I think we look at, it's a funny story because before COVID, Raisan and I sat down and we discussed what we wanted to do for the future. Like this was, I think, February, and we came up with like a brilliant schedule of like what we're gonna be discussing. We thought, oh, Khan's gonna be in like June, July, so let's talk about Indian movies that are playing there. Then we have our local festival that plays during September, October. Let's talk about a movie that comes out here. And the movie 83 was supposed to come out around April, so we thought we should go watch that, and I'll bring on a friend who I play cricket with, and we'll discuss that. And once COVID hit, all of that like went down the drain pretty much. So we had to like reevaluate like what is worth discussing, and some things happened in the broader world like that affected our like topics. For example, our second last episode we did was about colorism in Indian cinema, and that was directly influenced by the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening in America and all around the world. And we saw how Bollywood stars are kind of, putting up a black screen on Instagram and kind of just doing that, but at the same time promoting Fair and Lovely. So we thought that's hypocritical. So let's discuss it. And so we made an episode on that. Our last episode we did was about mental health and how it's discussed in Indian cinema. And we got some great people of a local organization about South Asian mental health. So they gave us a great little perspective on how the depiction is done in Bollywood. And so yeah, it's like we're trying to do it in a way that reflects what's going on in the world and what topics interest us. But sometimes we'll do things like, top 10 films of like the year, or top 10 films from our childhood, because on one hand, it allows us to be frank and honest about like what we love about Indian cinema, but it also gives like a well-rounded character to our podcast. So people know we're not all serious, or we like to have fun. And that's like what Indian cinema is to us. So yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly like, and I'm sure everyone feels this, like a balancing act when it comes to choosing your episodes. Like Matt and I are always trying to even out like stuff that's topical and new, stuff that just like deeply interests us, stuff that we think would be wildly entertaining. I'm so glad that the Priyanka Chopra time travel romance, I think it's 2050 to 2050, is finally available, because I always thought that would just be a hoot to discuss. So we're finally going to be able to discuss that one. And then stuff that our listeners ask us to discuss. And so it's always a balancing act, like what's going to be topical, what interests us. Matt and I often want to watch older films, but they don't necessarily do as well. So just that balancing act of, topics, and also like, trying to work in some important things in there, like you were saying, Ankur. Now, Manish, you often let your guests choose, but you've also been a guest on many Bollywood podcasts. And so I'm curious about how you go about choosing what you want to discuss when you're a guest, as well as, when people come on your show, because you don't have, or I haven't heard any guests on Queer and Now, how you go about choosing what you want to discuss. And then when you are discussing Bollywood and Indian cinema, what you think is most important to highlight.
Yeah, I will say that when I was a guest on Khandaan podcast, I was told to watch a movie called Wanted, and I will never forgive Asim for making me do that. And I'm waiting for my invitation to where I can pick a movie that I actually like.
Oh, so you didn't realize we got to pick Doom 3?
But Manish, you came on much earlier, and we weren't on the podcast. I am now thinking Wanted could not be more removed from the kind of movies you like.
It's like the exact opposite. I'm like, there's like no romance in this movie that's worth talking about. But I mean, like, like there, so it's interesting. Like when I was first started the podcast, I was actually very hesitant to talk about Bollywood movies, or I didn't want to talk about too many in a row, just because I wasn't quite sure if they would be downloaded as often. I wasn't quite sure of what my audience would be like. I didn't want to turn off audiences who didn't like Bollywood movies or didn't know enough. And as there are a lot of cinephiles who are curious and will listen to a podcast about any movie, even if they haven't seen it or have heard of it, or about any industry. And there's some that won't. So I was a little hesitant at first. And since then, I think I've gotten much more lax now that I feel more confident as a podcast host, and more confident of my listeners staying even when there is a movie that I'm talking about that might not immediately attract their attention. And I think that for me, when it comes to talking about Bollywood films on the podcast, one thing I really like highlighting is sort of the Bollywoodness of it. I think in a lot of discussions about Bollywood, that I've had sort of before, when I was getting to know a lot of the people in this sort of Bollywood sphere in the podcasting world, is just very much like forwarding the songs, or forwarding the comedy angle scenes, and like all that is like, some of it is extraneous, but sometimes it could be a lot of fun to sort of enjoy the high melodrama and all the things that make Bollywood so unique and so watchable and enjoyable for billions of people. I think I really like to highlight that, and also talk about some of the like themes and ideas and filmmaking techniques that translate globally. Even if you don't speak the language, you might understand a movie might have a plot point or a thematic or a theme that is universal and can be appreciated across borders. And as we all know, the Bollywood has a habit of lifting plots from Western movies or from other international cinema. And I'm also like, hey, if you like this movie, maybe you should try the Bollywood version. Or if you like the Bollywood version, maybe we can watch the original versions, or the American or the English version. So I think there's a lot to talk about, and I really am, I'd like to also focus more on like the films themselves versus, sort of the history, like the like the like context of the film, or like the stories about the actors and the, you know, stories from behind the sets. I don't know a lot about that stuff, so I tend to leave, you know, that part of the film, about that part of the film industry, to people who are more knowledgeable about it. I just want to focus on, like, you know, what are the films actually doing as pieces of art, and how are they going about doing, or like achieving those thematic goals that they have.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sometimes I mean, I do with Bollywood is for Lovers, we do try and give some context and background, though I think most people know it's research I do on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
But I mean, Wikipedia is a great resource. But when it comes down to it, you know, we want to discuss the films and do an analysis of the films themselves. And I always tell people, like, if you're interested in gossip, go elsewhere, because I don't have the time for gossip on the industry.
Yeah.
So recently, when Matt and I were on Khandaan, Amrita asked a great question that I decided to steal from her and lift
She
for our
tends to do that a lot.
Yeah.
Ask great questions.
and lift for our discussion here. And so I'm curious on if there's anything that you consider off limits in your discussion of Indian cinema and Bollywood, things you want to avoid that you don't feel you can discuss. And for Matt and I think this is a really interesting question, and I hope it's also an interesting one for you guys, because as white people discussing Indian cinema, discussing Bollywood, we know that we are not the target audience. We know that we do not have the cultural context sometimes to discuss the things that we are watching. And so there are things that we don't touch. A while back, I was talking to Manish about thinking about doing an episode on nepotism. And this was, I want to be very clear, years ago. It was when Janvi Kapoor was making her debut with Ishan Khatter in Dadak. And I was thinking, like, we were thinking of doing an episode about star kids that failed. And I asked Manish, like, is that too mean? I don't want my show to be mean. And Manish was very helpful and said, like, I trust you and Matt to do it in a good way, and in a way that, you know, is not not mean. But we ultimately decided not to do it. And considering what has become of the nepotism conversation in Bollywood in recently, I'm really glad we didn't do it, because I just maybe think that that's not a topic that we have a useful perspective on. Similarly, Ankur, and I'm going to throw it to you next. I was really thrilled that you guys did an episode on colorism, because that's something that as a white person, I can't discuss.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hear someone like me discuss that. I want to hear someone like you discuss that, someone who understands what they're talking about, because I would just be offensive if I tried to do that. And so that's something that Matt and I, you know, we think about a lot because of, you know, us being outsiders. But I'm curious if there's anything else that you guys feel that you don't want to touch, that you don't want to discuss. And when we were talking with Asim recently, we had a big question about, at this point, are we covering Kangana Ranawat films? Like, these are things that we have to ask ourselves. And so I'm curious on if there's things that you've decided not to discuss.
Yeah, I don't think Grace and I've sat down and talked about it. Yeah, we've never said like, oh, we shouldn't discuss certain topics. And I feel like, I don't want to speak for races, but I feel like, again, it's a matter of understanding your perspective on things and you understanding where you sit in society. Because I'm a cisgender heterosexual male, but I'm also Brahmin. I'm also like Hindu. So I have that perspective on things. So there's no way I can speak on behalf of anyone who isn't like me. So, and the privileges that I have and the, you know, the social class that I occupy allows me to understand certain things in certain ways. Like, for example, the colorism episode, we were like, we saw it as hypocritical. Like that was the big thing. Like all these stars are either promoting movies that are meant for darker skin characters or like actors, and or they're selling Fair and Lovely type products, like white skin whitening products. So that's hypocritical to us, and that's hypocritical to me. You can't say that and be like, oh, Black Lives Matter. Like there's a dissonance, there's a cognitive dissonance there. So that's how we tried to talk about colorism. We didn't try to be like, oh, you know, this is offensive to Black people because like, or like a Black perspective on how that would be perceived, because we're just never going to have that. Like we're not going to understand it. We can empathize with it, we can sympathize with it, but we will never understand it. And instead of, you know, like speaking on behalf of certain people, let's not do that. Let's talk about how we perceive things and give that perspective and like explain it. Like this is who we are as people and this is how we see it. Whether it's right or wrong is up for debate, and we'd love to talk to someone about it. But so yeah, for us it's just a matter of like, we know who we are, we acknowledge it, we acknowledge the privileges that we have, and once we do that, like it's not like we get free will to talk about anything. It's just like we have the nuance now. Like we know that what we can say and what we can't say. So yeah, like we've never sat down and said we'll not talk about Kangana or not. Like if we want to talk about it, we'll talk about it. Like whatever.
Yeah, that's been we've done an episode on Queen,
Yeah.
which at the time
Yeah, exactly.
and I mean I still like the film Queen, but I have questioned like, okay, would, if we were doing that episode next week, would we still choose to discuss that film? Would we still want to give the people who made it a platform? And I think, as you know, and so it's not just sometimes you know, that men are coming as outsiders. It's larger conversations like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, like as these movements, you know, impact the film industry and the Indian film industry, making those decisions about how you cover things and what you choose to cover. Manish?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, with Queer Now, my co-host Dave and I, we kind of, I won't speak for him, but I think we decided to just kind of talk about anything that comes up, you know, within the films that we talk about, especially, you know, talking about, you know, historical context and the political undertones or socio-political undertones of queer film. We haven't talked about Bollywood films yet, just because there's so few in, you know, that occupy the, you know, the queer space. But I think on It Ought to Be You, in general, because it's mostly I let my guests choose, I kind of hope that they do their own vetting and will choose a film that is somewhat free of these discussions, or at least in a way that we can sort of talk about the film and our enjoyment of it and not have to, you know, dig deep on these major political issues. I mean, I wanted It Ought to Be You to be a very positive, pleasant podcast, which is just people talking about movies they love. And but you know, I have talked about films from directors who I do not endorse or condone anymore. Not in Bollywood, but in general. And it was uncomfortable, honestly. And it took me way too long to even address sort of the elephant in the room. And that's an episode that I learned from. That was very early. This is like I think my third or fourth episode. So I learned my lesson on that, and was just like, okay, if it comes up, it's going to come up, and I'm just, you know, going to discuss it and, you know, get into it and talk about it. But I think in general, you know, I have like a list of Bollywood filmmakers and Bollywood, you know, actors, actresses who I don't want to speak about. And, you know, if they happen to come up as an option from, you know, from a guest or, you know, potential guest, I think I will kind of be like, I don't want to talk about, you know, this person or that person. I think it's a little too thorny. And I think that in terms of like topics, yeah, like Ankur is saying, there are a lot of things that I feel too privileged to speak about, where I feel like I was, speaking for a group. And also like you, Erin, like there's just some things I don't know too much about, and I would feel easier to direct people towards a podcast from hosts who actually know what they're talking about in that subject. And like I said earlier, I think gossip is another thing that I'm like, we can get into sort of like the bare bones of it, but I don't want to get into like, oh, well, this person's in this movie because of this reason and not this person. It's a little too heavy for kind of the light tone that I want to keep on the show.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think also sometimes with us, we're able to find guests who can speak to things that we can't.
Yeah.
And so that is that is a
Right.
way of sometimes filling mine and Matt's gaps.
Mhm.
Awesome. Anything to add?
I think you're talking about having guests on and people on that are more knowledgeable. I think I am very comfortable playing the role of the guy that doesn't know anything. So I think that is kind of, sometimes I think on the podcast I try to do that, and it kind of is again a good kicking off point, because I'm Muslim, I'm Pakistani or culturally Pakistani, and straight male. So a lot of this is about negotiating your privilege, right? And how we can talk about certain things, or how we can talk about certain things. I think because there has been this division between religion and countries, I tend to not talk about things like the caste system in India, which I frankly don't know enough about. And I don't want to tread on anybody's toes that they're very proud of their caste or whatever. I don't know anything about it. And then there's also topics like India, especially lately, has been making a lot of like anti-Pakistani movies. So I'll mention it a lot of times passingly, or make like a snide remark, but I never get into it that deep. And so war, caste, religion generally. But other than, there's also just a lot of topics that bore me, so I don't want to talk about them that much. Like, we go and like Kangana Ranaut being one of those, it just bores me at this moment. Nepotism bores me. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And then there's also just things that I've noticed. There's also been a lot of deaths in Bollywood lately, important ones. And about what Manish was saying, trying to be a happy, positive kind of place, and then, but you still feel you need to acknowledge somebody's career and passing. And I feel I struggle with that. And we just did a podcast, and it was a section about SP Bala, who's a very, very famous singer. And we talked about it for 15 minutes. And I was just editing it the other day, and I was just like, it just doesn't have that flow of and energy of what the Khandaan podcast is about. But you do feel you need to acknowledge it, especially because for Khan, for Bollywood fans, he was such a big important part of our Bollywood growing up. So I get uncomfortable talking about people's passing. So those are the kind of 3-4 topics that I don't know what to do with yet.
Matt and I made a similar decision in terms of deaths with Bollywood is for Lovers. We actually were recording an episode the morning that we found out that Sri Devi had passed away. And we made a conscious decision not to do memorial episodes. And I am not criticizing anyone who does, but we made that decision partly because we didn't grow up with these actors and actresses and filmmakers. And so wading into that when there are so many emotions that many fans are feeling, and we feel them too, but it's different for us. And so we just didn't really feel like it was our place. And then also, I don't want to profit in any way off of someone's death. And so I made a conscious decision. Well, Matt and I made it together that we didn't want to do memorial episodes because we didn't want to drive people to our show because of grieving, and we didn't want to take advantage of them. And so that's another thing that we decided not to do, though we do acknowledge them on the show, of course.
What you're saying is interesting, because it almost becomes about ownership of grief in a way, right? Who owns the grief? And with SP Bala, we had this thing that I'm only a Hindi cinema fan. So it's just one aspect of who this person was, right? He had a whole career in South India that I don't even know about. He is South Indian, he was South Indian himself. So who owns the grief, right? And I tend to also not lean into grief. I know that when people pass, people spend whole days watching their movies or listening to their songs. And I tend to avoid that. That's just my personality.
So before we wrap things up and see if there's any questions from the audience that they would like answered, I have, I think, probably the most important question in doing this panel, and that is, what role do you feel that podcasts play in the global discussion of Indian cinema and Bollywood? So Ankur, let's start with you.
What role? Yeah, that's a tricky question because even on this panel, like everyone's podcast does like a different thing. So like the role is dictated by that, I suppose. So regarding Parde Ke Peeche, like we find our role is to kind of fill in the gap of like, oh, there's this academic and critical lens in Indian cinema that's missing. So let's fill it. So we see it as our part as like, hey, we want to show how much we love Hindi cinema and how much we love Indian cinema. But we also have to acknowledge how little it's discussed, or when it's discussed, it's so minute, like it's so small. Like the discussion is just, it's either an ironic love for it, or it's either a like, you know, it's either I like Indian cinema, like parallel cinema, and Bollywood is cheap melodrama. And when in reality, you can find like beautiful things in Bollywood the same way you find in parallel cinema. And in parallel cinema, you can find things that aren't that interesting, or things that have been done to death. So I don't know. It's like for us, it's just, we know that there's something missing and we want to fill it in, because at the end of the day, like any type of art, I think it gives you a perspective of like one person's perspective on a certain story or a certain character. So if you can show that, if you can spread the like these films, or like spread the critical love for these films or whatever, you can show like it's a universal thing, I guess. So it's just spreading the love, I guess. Really, of like what Indian cinema is and what it can be. So yeah,
I think we can probably all relate to that motivation. Manish?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo, what Uncle was saying. I think, the word global, stood out to me. We're all from different countries, and, we've all connected with many people from all over the world through this. And it's a way to, I think, honestly, sometimes being a Bollywood fan in my experience can be a little lonely, even though it's such a like mass thing that everyone loves. But in terms of, appreciating it in this sort of critical lens, I think it's a especially, and even as people were all involved in, on social media and the film Twitter scene there, and we're a part of it, and we see it, and sometimes it can feel a little isolating to be like, hey guys, what about Bollywood? And everyone's kind of like, okay. But I think, with podcasting, it's like, it's been great to connect with everyone here and all the other podcasts that I listen to that I focus on Bollywood, and all the friends that I've made there and connections. And I think that is another role, is just bringing all these, people together who can appreciate Bollywood on this level, and, have a great discussion about so many wonderful movies and so many bad ones and so many problematic ones. Like we can all just kind of come together, and also, I mean, thankfully for social media as well, and we can just connect and get to know other people and have a discussion.
Awesome.
I love, we've all talked about, the critical analysis and the knowledge delivery. We've not talked about money at all. Like, like there's, like, I was just thinking about this, like all of us together have probably had millions of downloads and listeners. We've created thousands of hours of content, and all of us together have not earned $1,000 on it. Like it's just like love. This is like all love. And I think initially it was about podcasting was about knowledge delivery.
Mhm.
If they know about us, they might love us. But for me, more and more, it has become more a fight for validation, because I feel this idea of the marketplace of ideas doesn't exist. You have to fight for it. You have to go out and you have to go fight and let people know, because Bollywood hasn't had a Wong Kar Wai. We've not had an Ang Lee. We've not been put on that platform yet. We're still Ashton Kutcher selling Dorito chips and making weird facial expression wearing a sherwani. We're in that space. And I think a lot of that has to do in a way because the Asian male is not accepted as a sexual symbol or as an action star, like a physical threat. Women can be. You have the Priyanka Chopras, you have the Aishwarya Rais, but as a man, you're still not there. You can be a comedy guy, you can be the sidekick, but you cannot provide the physical threat. And I think until one of those three things doesn't happen, we get like a major Hindi Vidyut Jamwal type international star. Notice I did not mention Tiger Shroff. Or we have like a guy that can cross those barriers. Bollywood is not gonna be there as a film discussion medium for people, and I think hopefully that will happen. But until then, for us, it's about love. Like loving these movies and talking with the people, connecting with you guys. Manish, I hope to have Ankur on the podcast soon now too, and like connecting that way and just talking about our love, and then getting the love from our listeners. And that has been such a heartening thing. The emails and the messages we get. Like somebody was like, it's put me through the COVID. Somebody was a doctor and she was like, it's gotten me through the COVID pandemic. I was like, wow, this stupid conversation that I have with my friends is like doing such good. Like somebody emailed me about postpartum depression, that they had like a delivery and they were pregnant and were just listening to our podcast. And I think that's what makes it happen, because any other of those aspects is not going to be strong enough. It has to be love for the cinema and just enjoy doing this, I think.
I think what I'm hearing from you, Asim, is that more Western women and other people, regardless of sexual orientation, Western women and men need to discover Ranveer Singh.
Yeah, or me, or me.
I'm just saying, when I think of like male Bollywood sex symbols, I don't think anyone can deny.
Yeah, something
right.
needs to crack there. Something needs to happen, because I do think there's like a breakage there, I think. So,
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
Salman Khan is not going to do it, right, Manish?
No.
no, unfortunately. I think for Matt and I, a big part of why we keep doing the show is just to keep reiterating to people, these movies are worth watching regardless of your background. Film is one of the media that can transcend cultural barriers the easiest. These movies are worth watching. Everyone can enjoy them. There's a Bollywood film that everyone will like, regardless of what genres they are interested in, whether or not they like musicals. And so we just, we keep wanting to drive home that point of just trying to get more people to watch these movies as we explore them ourselves. So with that, I don't think we have any questions from the audience, which totally fine. I'm just going to throw it back to you guys so that you can plug your shows and where people can find you online. Manish?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at themanish89, and my podcasts are both on Twitter, Pod to Be You and at Queer Now Pod, which you can find on many podcasting apps like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, anywhere. So you can find my stuff there.
Ankur?
Yes, so you can find us on our main website. It's pkppodcast.wixsite.com/podcast. And you can follow us on Twitter at PKP Podcast. Same goes with Facebook and Instagram. And yeah, you can find me at Bland Banal Hump on Twitter as well. So.
And you have your Twitter name is really good.
Oh yeah, it's Abbas Mastan Kiristami. I've tried explaining it to people.
I get it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
it's so good.
Only 10 people can get that, so it's really tough to like explain to my non-cinephile friends, like, yeah, Abbas Kiarostami is like Iranian filmmaker, Abbas Mastan's Indian filmmakers, and they're like, just get
And
out.
two different, like
Yeah,
two very
exactly.
different modes of film.
Exactly. And they're like, just get out.
Awesome.
We're on upodcasting.com or khandaanpodcast.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Asim Burney. I'm very active there, way too much. I should not be, but hey, that's the world we're living in. But yeah, and I'm sure you guys are gonna tag our names in the file too. And yeah.
I'm Erin Fraser again. My Twitter handle is Erin E. Fraser, ERNE, FRASCR. The Bollywood show I do, the one that is relevant to this podcast, is called Bollywood is for Lovers. It's available on all of your mainstream podcatchers. We're on Twitter at BollywoodPod. We have a Tumblr and a Facebook page. My other show that I do with Paul Matwichuk is called Trash Art in the Movies. So that is also available in all the regular places. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And I think this was a great discussion. And I really appreciate all of your different perspectives. And I knew you all had different perspectives, which is why I really wanted to invite you all on to discuss what it's like being in this space and how we all go about it a bit differently, which, you know, I think there's so much room for more Bollywood podcasts, for more podcasts about Indian cinema. Again, we about South Indian cinema and Bengali cinema, etc., because there are so many movies to discuss and there are so many different perspectives and angles to take in those discussions. So again, thank you all so much. I also want to thank YEGPodfest and all the festival staff for having us and allowing us to do this, especially the tech director, Trent Crosby. And I want to thank YEGPodfest sponsors, the Edmonton Community Foundation, the Edmonton Arts Council, and City of Edmonton. Today is the last day of YEGPodfest, but there is still more awesome events to check out. Up next is another panel on millennials podcasting. So that'll be on in about a half an hour. And you can go to yegpodfest.ca for all of the event information for the rest of the day. This event has been free, but donations are welcome if you really enjoyed it and want to support the future of YEGPodfest. And lastly, LitFest, who is one of the big banner presenters of this festival. It's Canada's nonfiction festival. It starts October 15th. I have attended LitFest events many times over the years. They are always engaging and thought-provoking. This year is going to be no different, but it will be, more accessible online. So I encourage everyone to check out what LitFest has to offer. Thanks again.